Life Stories invites you to witness a tale of resilience, truth, and justice that will leave you inspired. In today's story, we follow Alisha Carter, a determined sister and a courageous U.S. Secret Service agent, as she takes on a biased legal system to defend her brother, Derek. Facing prejudice and arrogance at every turn, Alisha's unwavering belief in the truth becomes the catalyst for change, not just for her family, but for countless others. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey of hope, strength, and the fight for justice. Let's dive into this powerful story together. It was a morning like any other in Jefferson County's courthouse, where the marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights and the air carried an unspoken tension. People shuffled in their seats, waiting for the day's proceedings. Yet the atmosphere felt particularly charged. At the center of it all was a case that should have been straightforward. Derek Johnson, a quiet and hardworking man, stood accused of resisting arrest. As I sat in the gallery, observing, I couldn't help but notice the man at the defendant's table. Derek was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, yet his posture betrayed his vulnerability. His hands rested on the polished wood of the table, gripping it as if it were his lifeline. His face, though calm, revealed the wear of weeks spent battling not just the legal system but the weight of injustice itself. Sitting beside him was his sister, Alisha Carter, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. Alisha's presence was striking. She radiated a quiet strength that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. Her dark eyes scanned the room with precision, noting every movement, every whisper, every subtle smirk on the faces of those who had already decided Derek's fate before the trial began. She placed a hand on Derek's shoulder, her voice barely audible as she murmured something that seemed to steady him. Then came the man who had long dominated the courtroom, Judge Harold Cunningham. His arrival was announced by the heavy thud of the double doors swinging open and the rhythmic echo of his deliberate footsteps. Judge Cunningham was a man of sharp features and sharper words, known across Jefferson County for his harsh rulings and thinly veiled biases. His robe billowed behind him as he ascended to his seat, a throne of authority he wielded with an iron hand. Court is now in session, the bailiff declared, his voice reverberating off the walls. Judge Cunningham settled into his high-backed chair, scanning the courtroom with a look that was equal parts boredom and disdain. His eyes lingered on Alisha, and a faint smirk curled at the corners of his thin lips. It was as if he'd already decided her worth, already measured her against his standards and found her lacking. As the trial began, the prosecutor, Martin Gray, rose to deliver his opening remarks. His tone was confident, almost theatrical, as though he were performing for an audience rather than presenting facts in a court of law. He described Derek as a man with a blatant disregard for authority, his words dripping with exaggeration and subtle venom. The smirk on Gray's face deepened as he glanced at Derek, as if daring him to react. From where I sat today, I could see Alisha's jaw tighten ever so slightly. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. She had promised Derek she would let the lawyers do their job, no matter how much she wanted to step in and defend him herself. When the defense attorney, Kevin Dawson, finally rose to speak, the difference was palpable. Kevin was young, and his nerves showed in the way his hands fumbled with his notes. His voice wavered as he addressed the judge, and Judge Cunningham's impatience was evident. "Well," the judge barked, his tone slicing through the room like a knife. "Do you have anything meaningful to add? Or are you just wasting this court's time?" Kevin stammered, searching for his words, and Judge Cunningham sighed loudly, a performative show of his irritation. Alisha's gaze shifted to the judge, her expression calm but unyielding. She had dealt with men like him before, men who measured authority by their ability to belittle others. When it came time for Alisha to testify as a character witness, the tension in the room thickened. She rose from her seat, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the stand. All eyes were on her, the calm yet formidable presence that seemed to defy the judge's expectations. "Miss Carter," Judge Cunningham drawled, leaning back in his chair with a mocking air. "I trust you'll keep this brief. We deal in facts here, not feelings." Alisha's response was measured, her voice steady. "I'm here to speak the truth, Your Honor. Nothing more, nothing less." The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that follows a statement too bold to ignore. Judge Cunningham's faint smirk returned, and he leaned forward as if preparing to deliver a crushing retort. "You seem to think you know the law better than the people in this room," he sneered. "Tell me, do you have any actual experience? Or are you just another activist with opinions?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Alisha's face, a spark of anger quickly extinguished by her remarkable composure. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she met the judge's condescending gaze, letting the weight of her silence settle over the room. As Alisha returned to her seat, the judge's mocking laughter lingered in the air. I saw Derek's hand gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Alisha leaned toward him, her voice firm but soothing. "It's not over," she whispered. "Not yet." The words carried a quiet conviction, a promise of something unseen yet inevitable. In that moment, I realized that this trial was about far more than Derek Johnson or Judge Cunningham. It was about the courage to stand in the face of arrogance, the resilience to endure, and the belief that even in the darkest places, truth can find its way through. The morning sun filtered weakly through the high windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, casting long streaks of pale light onto the polished floors. As the trial moved forward, the tension in the room only grew heavier, thick like a storm cloud about to break. Derek sat at the defendant's table, his large hands gripping the edge as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. His usually confident demeanor had been stripped away over the weeks, replaced by quiet endurance. Alisha sat beside him, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She radiated an unshakable calm, but I could sense the turmoil just beneath the surface. Her dark eyes scanned the courtroom, taking in every detail: the prosecutor Martin Gray's smug posture as he adjusted his tie, the hushed whispers among the spectators, and the faintly judgmental stares from the jury. Martin Gray rose to present the prosecution's case. His voice was smooth, polished from years of practice, as he began weaving a narrative that painted Derek as a volatile threat to law enforcement. His words were carefully chosen, crafted to provoke fear and indignation rather than present facts. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gray began, his voice filled with a practiced authority, "what we have here is a man who chose to defy the law. A man who, when approached by a police officer during a routine traffic stop, escalated the situation into chaos." As he spoke, Gray paced slowly, each step deliberate, his tone dripping with calculated confidence. He gestured dramatically toward Derek. "This is not a case of misunderstanding or overreaction. This is a blatant disregard for the authority that keeps our society safe." I glanced at Alisha. Her jaw tightened, and her hands gripped the hem of her blazer for just a moment before she released it. She had heard these kinds of stories before, stories crafted not from facts but from prejudice. She remained silent, though I could see the fire behind her composed expression. Gray continued his performance, presenting the arresting officer as a hero, a man who had acted with restraint in the face of Derek's supposed aggression. He conveniently omitted the details captured in the video: the officer shoving Derek without provocation, shouting commands at him in escalating tones, and drawing his weapon over a minor infraction. When Gray finally sat down, his self-satisfied smirk lingered like a bad taste in the room. Alisha leaned slightly toward Derek and whispered something that only he could hear. Whatever she said, it seemed to steady him, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. Then it was Kevin Dawson's turn. The young defense attorney rose from his seat, clutching his notes with trembling hands. He was clearly outmatched by Gray's confidence, and Judge Cunningham's impatient glare did little to help his nerves. Your Honor, Kevin began, his voice shaking slightly. We believe the evidence will show that Derek Johnson did not resist arrest. In fact, it will show that he was the victim of unnecessary force and misconduct. Judge Cunningham let out an audible sigh, his expression a mix of disdain and boredom. Let's move it along. Mr. Dawson. We don't have all day. Kevin nodded quickly, his face flushed, and stumbled over his next words. He referenced the video evidence, the eyewitness statements, and the arresting officer's questionable record. But his delivery lacked the conviction needed to pierce the courtroom's thick air of doubt. Alisha's frustration was palpable, though she kept it tightly contained. She had always been the kind of person who acted with purpose, who didn't waste words or energy. Watching Kevin flounder, she seemed to make a silent decision to take control when the opportunity presented itself. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Judge Cunningham wasn't interested in a fair fight. He interrupted Kevin's statements with dismissive waves of his hand, ignored objections from the defense, and openly sighed when Alisha prepared to take the stand as a character witness. Miss Carter, the judge drawled, leaning back in his chair. I hope you're not planning to waste this court's time with sentimental nonsense. We deal in facts here, not feelings. Alisha rose to her feet, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked to the witness stand. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations, her every step deliberate. I'm here to speak the truth. Your Honor, she said evenly, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. Nothing more, nothing less. Her calm composure seemed to unsettle the room. For the first time that day, the spectators fell silent, their attention entirely focused on her. As Alisha recounted the events leading up to Derek's arrest, she painted a vivid picture of a man who had been unfairly targeted and humiliated. But every time she tried to elaborate, Judge Cunningham interrupted, his tone growing sharper with each dismissal. Miss Carter, he said with a condescending chuckle, you seem to think you're an expert on law enforcement. Tell me, do you have any actual experience? Or are you just another activist with opinions? A spark of anger flashed in Alisha's eyes, but she suppressed it, her voice remaining calm. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, I believe my testimony speaks for itself. As she returned to her seat, the judge's mocking laughter echoed faintly in the room. Derek turned to her, his face pale with tension. It's not over, Alisha whispered to him, her voice firm. Trust me, it's not over. Little did the courtroom know, Alisha Carter was far more than she appeared, and the truth she carried would soon shatter the carefully constructed narrative surrounding Derek's case. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense as the trial dragged on. Judge Cunningham's dismissive attitude had created an almost oppressive environment, one where the defense's voice was barely allowed to rise above a whisper. Alisha Carter, however, sat poised and unyielding, her presence like an anchor in the storm. Derek sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes flickering between the prosecutor's smirk and the judge's cold glare. Alisha reached over and gave his arm a gentle squeeze, her silent reassurance that she was there for him, no matter how grim the situation seemed. As the prosecution presented its final witness, Alisha's sharp gaze never left the man speaking. It was the arresting officer, Officer James Corrigan, whose testimony was filled with well-rehearsed statements that painted Derek as aggressive and uncooperative. He refused to comply with my orders, Corrigan said, his voice steady. I gave him multiple opportunities to cooperate, but he chose to escalate the situation. Alisha's lips tightened, her hands resting motionless on the table. She knew the officer's words didn't align with the video footage. And yet, here he was, twisting the truth with unnerving confidence. When it came time for the defense to cross-examine, Kevin Dawson stood, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the trial's imbalance. He asked pointed questions, trying to highlight the inconsistencies in Corrigan's testimony. Officer Corrigan. Kevin began. You stated that Mr. Johnson was non-compliant. Is that correct? That's correct. Corrigan replied. And yet, the video evidence shows that Mr. Johnson had his hands raised and was speaking calmly. Can you explain the discrepancy? Corrigan's jaw tightened ever so slightly. But he recovered quickly. The video doesn't capture the full context of the situation. From my perspective, his behavior was aggressive. Kevin pressed further. But Judge Cunningham soon cut him off with a sharp rap of his gavel. Move it along. Mr. Dawson, the judge said. His tone sharp. We've heard enough. The moment Kevin returned to his seat, Alisha leaned toward him. Her voice quiet but firm. Let me take the stand, she said. Kevin hesitated, glancing at Derek, who nodded slightly. Finally, Kevin stood and announced, Your Honor, the defense would like to call Alisha Carter to the stand. The judge's eyebrows lifted in faint amusement, and he gestured lazily toward the witness stand. By all means. Let's see what Miss Carter has to say. I hope she can keep it brief. Alisha rose, her heels clicking purposefully against the polished floor as she approached the stand. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. As she took her seat, she adjusted the microphone and looked directly at Judge Cunningham. What qualifies you to speak on this matter? Miss Carter, the judge asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Do you have any first-hand experience with law enforcement? For a moment, Alisha said nothing. She simply reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, black leather case. With a deliberate motion, she flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. The courtroom collectively inhaled, a ripple of gasps spreading through the gallery. My name, she said, her voice steady, is Special Agent Alisha Carter, United States Secret Service. The reaction was immediate. The prosecutor froze, his confident smirk vanishing. Even Judge Cunningham, who had been leaning back in his chair with an air of superiority, straightened, his expression faltering. Special Agent, the judge repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Alisha nodded, her tone unchanging. Yes, Your Honor. I've spent the past decade protecting this country's leaders and investigating matters of national security. I've conducted operations under immense pressure, and I know how to recognize the truth when I see it. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but Alisha silenced them with her commanding presence. I've reviewed the video evidence, spoken to witnesses, and seen how this case has been handled, she continued. And what I see is a miscarriage of justice. Judge Cunningham's face flushed red, and he banged his gavel to regain control of the room. Agent Carter, he said, his voice strained. This is highly irregular. With all due respect, Your Honor. Alisha replied, her tone calm but unyielding. What's irregular is the way this case has been handled. The evidence exonerates my brother. Yet this courtroom has been more focused on dismissing the truth than delivering justice. The judge's lips tightened, and for the first time, his usual air of dominance wavered. Alisha's words hung in the air, heavy with undeniable authority. As she stepped down from the stand, Alisha's badge still glinted under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, a stark reminder that she was far more than the judge or prosecutor had assumed. Derek's eyes followed his sister, his expression a mix of awe and hope. It's not over, Alisha said quietly as she returned to her seat, her voice filled with quiet determination. But we're just getting started. The tide had shifted, and the once smug faces in the courtroom were now laced with uncertainty. For the first time since the trial began, the truth was no longer something they could ignore. The courtroom buzzed with tension following Alisha's stunning revelation. Whispers spread like wildfire through the gallery. But amidst the noise, Alisha Carter sat quietly at the defense table, her composure unshaken. The badge she had displayed moments earlier still seemed to linger in the room, an unspoken challenge to the authority of Judge Cunningham and the narrative crafted by the prosecution. Judge Cunningham, his face a shade darker than usual. Tapped his pen against the desk with short, clipped movements. His usual commanding air had faltered, replaced by an uncharacteristic unease. Yet, he wasn't ready to relinquish control. "Order in the court," he barked, banging his gavel twice for good measure. His voice, though steady, lacked its former edge. "Agent Carter, while your credentials are noteworthy, they do not exempt you from the decorum expected in this courtroom." Alisha met his gaze without flinching, her calm demeanor unnerving him further. "With respect, Your Honor," she said evenly, "decorum should never come at the expense of justice. I'm here to ensure the truth is heard." The judge leaned back, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then, with a sharp inhale, he turned his attention to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, regaining some of his composure, "please disregard the theatrics. We are here to examine the facts." But the facts were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The video evidence that had been waved away earlier was now replayed, this time under the scrutiny of Alisha's unyielding presence. On the screen, the events of Derek's arrest played out in stark clarity. The courtroom fell silent as the footage showed Derek calmly complying with the officer's commands, his hands raised in submission. Then came the moment that had sparked the entire case, Officer Corrigan shoving Derek against the car and escalating the situation without cause. The sound of Derek hitting the ground was audible even through the grainy recording, followed by the sharp bark of commands from Corrigan. Gasps rippled through the spectators, and I noticed a shift in the jury's expressions. Where there had been indifference or doubt, there was now discomfort, even guilt. Martin Gray, the prosecutor, stood quickly, his movements abrupt as he tried to regain control. "Your Honor," he said, his voice louder than necessary, "the video alone does not tell the full story. We must rely on the officer's testimony, which has been consistent and credible." Alisha's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, a subtle acknowledgement of the prosecutor's desperation. She turned her attention to Kevin Dawson, who had grown visibly more confident in the wake of her testimony. He rose to his feet, his tone calm but firm. "Consistent, perhaps," Kevin said, gesturing toward the screen. "But credible? I think the jury can decide for themselves." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the jurors. "What you see here is a man complying with law enforcement. A man who did nothing to provoke the aggression he endured. This video is not just evidence, it's the truth." The weight of his words settled over the room, and for a moment, even Judge Cunningham seemed to hesitate. His gavel remained still as Kevin continued. "This case is not about resisting arrest," Kevin said, his voice rising with conviction. "It's about accountability. It's about recognizing when those in power abuse their authority and ensuring that justice prevails." Alisha watched the jury closely, her sharp eyes noting every flicker of recognition, every shift in body language. The truth was breaking through the carefully constructed walls of bias that had surrounded the case. Judge Cunningham cleared his throat, his expression a mixture of frustration and discomfort. "Enough," he said, though his voice lacked its usual force. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Alisha turned to Derek. His shoulders, once hunched under the weight of the trial, now seemed to carry a hint of relief. "We're making progress," Alisha said quietly, her voice steady. Derek nodded, though the tension in his face hadn't completely faded. "Do you think they'll see it?" he asked, his tone tinged with doubt. Alisha's gaze was unwavering. "They're starting to," she replied. "The truth has a way of cutting through even the thickest fog. We just have to keep going." The courthouse emptied slowly, people whispering in hushed tones as they left. Outside, the cool evening air carried a sense of anticipation, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Alisha stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, her silhouette framed by the fading light. She turned to Derek, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "This isn't just about you," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "It's about everyone who has ever been judged unfairly, silenced, or dismissed. We're not just fighting for your freedom, we're fighting to expose a system that needs to change." Derek looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and awe. "I don't know how you do it, Alisha," he said. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "One step at a time," she replied. "And we're not stepping back." As they walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the day still heavy on their shoulders, one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. But the tide was beginning to turn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Jefferson County Courthouse as the final day of the trial began. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes every breath feel heavier. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Spectators whispered in hushed tones. The jury filed into their seats, and Derek Johnson sat at the defense table, his face etched with both hope and apprehension. Alisha Carter was beside him, her presence as steady as ever. Her hands rested on the table, her fingers lightly touching Derek's, a silent reassurance that she was with him through whatever came next. Though her outward composure was unshaken, her sharp eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. She knew that this day would decide not just her brother's future but something far greater: the fight to reclaim the truth in a system riddled with bias. Judge Cunningham entered the room with his usual commanding stride, his black robe billowing behind him. Yet, there was something different about him today. His movements seemed stiffer, his expression more guarded. It was as if Alisha's revelation had shaken him, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable reality of the trial. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. The prosecutor, Martin Gray, rose first to deliver his closing argument. His voice was as polished and theatrical as ever, but there was a new edge of desperation in his tone, a faint crack in his confidence that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Gray began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box, "we've presented clear evidence that Derek Johnson resisted arrest. The testimony from Officer Corrigan, combined with the context of the events, paints an undeniable picture of a man who defied law enforcement." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the jurors as if daring them to disagree. "Do not let emotional appeals and irrelevant distractions cloud your judgment. This is a court of law, and the facts are what matter." Gray's words hung in the air, but the room didn't seem convinced. There was a growing unease in the gallery, a silent acknowledgement that the truth wasn't as black and white as the prosecutor claimed. When it was time for the defense, Kevin Dawson stood, his hands steady as he adjusted his notes. The young attorney had found his footing thanks to Alisha's unwavering support, and now he spoke with a confidence that filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kevin began, his voice calm but firm, "this case is not about resisting arrest. It's about accountability. It's about holding those in power to the same standards we expect of everyone else." He gestured toward the screen, where the video evidence had been played. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony." Derek Johnson did not resist. What he faced that day was an abuse of authority, an act of aggression that was unwarranted and unjustified. Kevin's words were measured but powerful. He didn't raise his voice or rely on theatrics. Instead, he let the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, he shifted the energy in the room. The jury leaned forward, their expressions softening as they absorbed his argument. When Kevin finished, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Judge Cunningham, who sat motionless for a long moment before finally speaking. "The jury will now deliberate," he said, his voice tight. "This court is adjourned until a verdict is reached." The hours that followed were excruciating. Alisha and Derek sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, the muted hum of distant conversations their only background noise. Derek was restless, his fingers tapping against the arm of the bench as he stared at the floor. Angie, he said quietly, using the nickname only she called him. What if they don't see it? What if the jury can't look past the lies? Alisha turned to him, her gaze steady and filled with quiet determination. They'll see it, she replied. The truth is there, clear as day. They just have to be brave enough to act on it. Derek nodded, though the doubt in his eyes lingered. Alisha reached for his hand and held it firmly. No matter what happens, Derek, we'll keep fighting. This is bigger than us. And we're not alone in this. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, the tension was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral, and the foreperson rose with a folded piece of paper in her hand. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Cunningham asked, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Yes, Your Honor, the foreperson replied, her voice trembling slightly. Alisha sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Derek was beside her, his shoulders rigid, his gaze fixed on the foreperson as if the entire world hung on her next words. On the charge of resisting arrest, the foreperson began. We find the defendant, Derek Johnson, not guilty. The words echoed through the room, and for a moment, there was silence, stunned, disbelieving silence. Then, like a dam breaking, murmurs and gasps rippled through the gallery. Beside me, Derek exhaled a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. Alisha reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. It's over, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet triumph. We did it. Judge Cunningham's gavel struck the desk, but the sound lacked its usual authority. Order in the court, he snapped. His face flushed. The defendant is free to go. Derek turned to Alisha, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, hope. Thank you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Alisha smiled, her expression soft but resolute. This is just the beginning. Derek, she said, the fight isn't over yet. As they left the courthouse together, the sun shining brightly overhead, it felt as though, for the first time in a long time, justice had been served. The courtroom's echoes of celebration had barely faded when Alisha Carter stepped into the bright sunlight outside Jefferson County Courthouse. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as they shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of curiosity and urgency. Derek stayed close to her, his shoulders hunched as if trying to shield himself from the overwhelming attention. Agent Carter, a reporter called. Now that your brother has been acquitted, what's next? Will you pursue further action against the officer involved? Alisha raised a hand, silencing the crowd with her calm but firm presence. Today is about my brother's freedom, she said evenly, her voice carrying over the noise. But let me be clear, this fight doesn't end here. What happened to Derek is part of a much larger problem, and we all have a responsibility to ensure justice for everyone. Her words were measured, but the passion beneath them was unmistakable. The reporters pressed forward, but Alisha turned to Derek, her hand on his arm, guiding him away from the frenzy. They made their way to a waiting car, its sleek black frame gleaming under the afternoon sun. As the driver opened the door, Derek hesitated, turning to face Alisha. Angie, he said quietly, using her childhood nickname. I don't even know how to thank you. You stood up for me when no one else would. You believed in me. Alisha looked at him, her expression softening. You don't need to thank me, Derek. You're my brother. But this isn't just about you. What happened in that courtroom today is a step forward. But it's just the beginning. There are so many others who've been in your shoes. And we can't stop fighting for them. Derek nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I want to help. Angie. I want to make sure no one else goes through what I did. Alisha smiled, a rare flicker of pride lighting her face. Then let's do it together. In the weeks that followed, Alisha and Derek found themselves at the forefront of a growing movement for justice. Derek began sharing his story at community events. His voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each telling. He spoke to groups of young people, many of whom saw themselves in his struggle. And his words gave them hope. Meanwhile, Alisha balanced her demanding career as a Secret Service agent with her newfound role as an advocate. She attended forums, met with legal reform organizations, and lent her voice to calls for systemic change. Her presence carried weight. Her badge a symbol not just of authority but of integrity and truth. At one of these forums, held in a packed community center, Alisha stood before a crowd of activists, lawyers, and families who had suffered under the weight of an unjust system. Her speech was not rehearsed but came from the heart, each word resonating with those who listened. Justice is not a guarantee, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It's something we have to fight for, something we have to demand. What happened to Derek was not unique. It's part of a system that often values power over truth, authority over accountability. But change is possible if we refuse to be silent. The crowd erupted into applause. But Alisha remained composed. She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of those who had come seeking hope. This fight isn't just mine, she continued. It's ours. Every voice matters. Every action matters. Together, we can create a system that upholds the values we all deserve: fairness, integrity, and justice. Among the crowd, Derek watched his sister with pride. He had always known her as strong, but seeing her transform her personal battle into a mission for change inspired him in a way he hadn't thought possible. Months later, Alisha received a call from Derek. His voice carried a new confidence, a lightness she hadn't heard in years. "Angie," he said, "I spoke at a youth center today. Told them my story. Everything I went through. You should have seen their faces. They listened. They really listened." Alisha smiled, leaning back in her chair. "That's incredible. Derek, I'm so proud of you." He paused, his tone softening. "You're the reason I could do it. You gave me the strength to keep going." Alisha's voice was warm but resolute. "You had that strength all along, Derek. You just needed to see it." As the months turned to years, Alisha and Derek's efforts continued to grow, their influence expanding far beyond Jefferson County. They became symbols of hope and resilience, proof that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, change was possible. On a crisp autumn evening, Alisha stood on the stage of a national justice reform conference. The lights bright and the room packed. Her voice carried the weight of all she had seen and fought for. "This is not just about Derek or me," she said. "This is about every person who has been judged, silenced, or dismissed. It's about creating a world where truth matters, where justice is not just an ideal but a reality." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. But Alisha didn't bask in it. She stepped back, letting the moment belong to the movement they had built together. As she walked off the stage, she felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing the fight was far from over. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she was certain they were headed in the right direction. As the story of Alisha and Derek Carter comes to a close, it serves as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice is never a solitary journey. Through courage, resilience, and unwavering belief in the truth, they turned a personal fight into a movement for change. Their efforts inspired countless others to stand up against injustice and demand accountability from the systems meant to serve them. But this is only the beginning. The road to equality and fairness is long, and every voice counts in shaping a better future. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of courage, transformation, and hope. Together, we can learn from these incredible journeys and strive for a world where justice is within reach for everyone. Stay tuned for our next chapter, coming soon.